It's my great privilege to introduce Susan Eastman, who's Associate Research Professor of New Testament at Duke University. I was visiting Duke with Andre last year, and we met Susan, and despite coming from very different backgrounds, instantly recognized ideas and shared enthusiasms and interests. And so I think one of the voices which is really important is to hear about biblical anthropology and how that voice, the voice of anthropology from a biblical perspective, can be engaged in this conversation. So this is Susan's field, and I'm delighted to introduce her to talk on that topic.
I think I'm now wired for sound. That's about as technological as I get, is to be wired from sound. So actually this is going to be rather different today because I don't have a PowerPoint, and I feel ambivalent about that. I feel in one sense deficient, perhaps even a little less than human, not having a PowerPoint. But on the other hand, I think what a radical idea to just have face-to-face conversation that is not mediated in some way by a machine. So let's try that out and see how that goes. So I'm going to give a more traditional talk. And basically, the topic is biblical and scientific anthropologies in conversation, but the title is The Size of the System That We Are. That's what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to talk about that in terms of, yes, a biblical anthropology in conversation with some, not all, scientific anthropologies that are amenable to a biblical anthropology. These are broad stroke terms. But last night there was a very lively debate about what is it to be a person. And that's the topic today. And as I was putting forth my theological perspectives on this, just in conversation around a table, some of the pushback was, well, this is all well and good, but how do you talk with scientists about this, or people who do not share this view? So I want to highlight some common ground among some scientific perspectives in current work on personhood. Okay, so that's what I'll be doing. First, a little bit setting the stage, which has been done a lot here already, so I'll be very brief on that. In a 2012 commemoration of the centenary of Turing's birth, Nature magazine invited some scientists to reflect on the relationship between neuroscience and computing by addressing the question, is the brain a good model for machine intelligence? It seems to be something we've been talking about a lot here. So Demis Hassabis was one of the respondents, and not surprisingly, he said enthusiastically, yes. Neuroscience has a great deal to contribute to AI research, particularly by translating the brain's activity into algorithmic equations. There's no surprises here. He says, from a neuroscientific perspective, attempting to distill intelligence into an algorithmic construct may prove to be the best path to understanding some of the enduring mysteries of our minds, such as consciousness and dreams. So Hassabis is assuming that the human brain is the model for intelligent machines, and then the converse also becomes true. The machine is the model for the brain, and indeed for the mysteries of human personhood, consciousness, dreams. And this is so whether or not the brain is self-contained in the head or even operating through the body so that machines might be designed to be learning machines in interaction with the environment. It's still the case that this is basically can be reduced and adequately modeled as a set of algorithms. I think that would be, we've heard about this from some of our computer scientist friends here. Now, Rodney Brooks takes an opposing view, and he says this, I believe we are in an intellectual cul-de-sac in which we model brains and computers on each other, and so prevent ourselves from having deep insights that would come from new models. And he attributes this to Turing, and observes the inadequacy and yet ubiquity of the model with its two-way range of influence. We model machines after machine-like computational models of the brain in this self-replicating cycle. And the problem, says Brooks, is this doesn't get at the complexity of biological life, which also is systemic biological life. It's not biological life in distinction, separate from others, but biological life that involves us in larger systems of life. So that's his critique. But he's worried because the brain has become a digital computer and we're still trying to make our machines intelligent. By the way, last night I read in the New York Times an article about recent research on rationality and intelligence, saying these are not the same. Intelligence, high IQs often score low on the rationality scores, however they do this, but high on intuition scores. So the complexity is here. All right. Now, my issue, and I think this has been coming up around the edges here, is what does this reverse modeling do to our understandings of personhood? What does this, not so much all the issues around creating intelligent, quote unquote, machines, but the issues around the effect, the reverse effect on human beings as we begin to model ourselves. We have an image that can be put into a machine that then tells us who we are, in some sense, that we are mirrored back to ourselves in ways that, that do not capture the whole of what we are. Biblically speaking, this would be called idolatry, that we create something in our image, and then our image is reduced by that. But scientifically speaking, at least according to some neuroscientists and experimental psychologists, there's also a deep problem here, because seeing the person as a set of mental algorithms makes at least two mistakes. It ignores, says, as Brooks says, the role of the body in cognition, in the feedback loop between the body and the brain, and it ignores the larger systemic system of the self in the loop between brain, body, and environment in which human identity is shaped and expressed. So what I want to do this morning is set forth a structure of human personhood, a structure that is found in both biblical notions of the person and some current scientific accounts of what it means to be human. So I'll start with the work of Sean Gallagher. Sean Gallagher is a philosopher who works with cognitive scientists on the question of how the body shapes the mind. He has a book entitled How the Body Shapes the Mind, and what that question means for the picture of what it means to be a person. So in that book, Gallagher actually has conducted experiments with, as well as in conversation with, a variety of scientists approaching these problems. So he reflects on studies of imitation of facial movements by infants who will imitate facial movements within an hour of birth. This work has been done by Andrew Meltzoff and a team and around the world, that infants will imitate faces within an hour of birth. That he also looks at studies of mirror neurons, or visual motor neurons to be more precise, in monkeys and in fMRIs. And research on body schema, the use of gesture in patients who are blind or who have suffered severe brain trauma and lost awareness of parts or all of their bodies and yet use gestures. And so he sums up towards the end a partial list of findings from these studies. Within minutes, within an hour after birth, infants will imitate faces. They will respond, and there are studies done to show that this is not simply a reflex action. People without either motor or visual access to their own bodily actions, without proprioception, or blind, or both in some way, they will still gesture in a normal manner as they tell a story. That's a really interesting thing. They don't even necessarily feel what their body is doing, but their hands will gesture as they're telling a story. You know, a blind person can't see it, but the hands will gesture. What's going on with that? Mirror neurons, the visual observation. I'm sure many people here are familiar with this, but if I pick up an object, the neurons required for picking up that object will fire in your brain at the same time by the perception of the object. So the same neurons are activated by doing an action and by seeing that action performed. There is a link, a neural link between perception and action. These are contested kinds of territories, but these claims, I think, are pretty well agreed on. So in talking about this, what Gallagher says is that there's something in our body that has a propensity towards connection, a propensity to imitate, and a propensity to do activities that connect us with others, because gesture is not a movement. He analyzes this. What kind of movement is gesture? And he says, well, it's not locomotive, it's not instrumental, it's expressive. And as expressive movement, it assumes an audience, it assumes an other who is receiving that expression, and the body is somehow doing this. The body has this propensity towards connection. And we don't need a lot of, well, I can just say that as I'm driving down the road, I don't know about you, but oftentimes I talk to somebody who's not there. I may be having a conversation as I drive down the road, and I may be using my hands to gesture. Why am I doing that? What is it in me? There is something in us that does this on a prevolitional level, on a subpersonal level. Now, Gallagher puts it this way. He says, before you know it, your body makes you human. Before you know it, your body makes you human. Your body makes you connect with others, I think is what he means by that. And there is considerable evidence that this connection is necessary to life itself. To be deprived of human connection is incredibly debilitating. And we know this from accounts of children raised in orphanages or other environments where they are denied human contact. So, for example, the famous thought experiment, Jackson's thought experiment about Mary that was talked about yesterday. Mary, the brilliant color scientist who lives all by herself in a black and white room and only understands the qualia of red once she actually sees red. So Eleanor Stump is a philosopher who has taken up that and revamped it, that thought experiment, to say, imagine Mary in a room, black and white room, who knows that her mother loves her, but until she actually comes out of the room and meets her mother, she doesn't know her mother's love in a direct way. Stump is using this to talk about different kinds of knowledge. But I would push it a little further and say, without the human contact from the beginning, Mary could not become the brilliant scientist that she is in a room by herself, because she would not have what Peter Hobson, as developmental psychologist, talks about as the cradle of thought. She would not have the interpersonal interaction from the beginning that would scaffold even the capacity for cognition and language necessary for cognition. And so the idea of a brilliant scientist alone in a room from the beginning, developing individually, as this is deeply in question from the perspective of people like Andrew Meltzoff or a neuroscientist like Vittorio Galesi, who works on mirror neurons, and who would say that our neural systems create what he calls a we-centric space, or an intersubjectivity that precedes subjects through the activity of the neural system of the body. Now, at the same time, this kind of connectivity mediated through the body also renders us tremendously vulnerable. So this idea of body as connection means that, well, as the previous illustrations show, we are vulnerable to toxic environments, whether those be relational or physical, from lead poisoning and its effect on children's developing minds, to the effects of abandonment or abuse in childhood. We could name many, many ways in which our connectivity means we cannot wall out bad influences either. We are vulnerable. Now, this picture of what it means to be a person is very far from the idea of a brain in a vat or mapping the brain through algorithms. It's very different also from the ideas of human beings as freestanding, self-determining, isolated, discrete individuals who only as individuals are capable of being in relationship with others. It reverses that picture and says that constituted on a foundation ontological ground of being that is relational from the start, we then become capable of individual action. It's not an either-or, in my view, between individual and corporate. But there's a very important way in which they are related, and it makes a difference how we think about that. So to quote Gallagher again, we are not just what happens in our brains. The loop of who we are extends through and is limited by our bodily capacities into the surrounding environment, which is social as well as physical, and feeds back through our conscious experience into the decisions we make. In other words, if we think we can get to a proper description, let alone explanation, of who and what we are, how we think, how we decide, how we act by models of a brain in a vat, or even by looking at the individual body-brain system in isolation, in Gallagher's words, we fail to recognize the true size of the system that we are, the larger system of body-environment intersubjectivity. So this is a structure of the person as a self in relationship to our environment and primarily other people. And all of these go into this system of body-environment intersubjectivity, in Gallagher's words. So there are three key claims embedded in this one statement, at least, probably more. One is that human beings are fully embodied. So there's a constant exchange going on all the time between bodily data and mental processes, which are also located in the body. And this is linked to, but not fully identifiable with, our sense of ourselves. Secondly, human beings, as fully embodied, are also embedded in our complex physical and relational environments because our bodies connect us with everything around us and internalize. There is a traffic. So skin is more of a conductor than a barrier in that sense. This is also in the ancient world. I won't go down that route, but we find these ideas also in the ancient world of the self as malleable, as porous, as vulnerable, as connected, and the body as immediately even made up of the stuff that's outside the body, so that psychological, physical well-being and environmental factors all go together. Our primary mode of being is in relationship, which we might say then means our mode of being is by belonging. We live in the mode of belonging. Okay, thirdly, simply because as bodies, we are socially and environmentally networked, both strengthened and constrained by the network of relational realities in which we live, there is no intrinsically libertarian sort of, I think that term was used yesterday about free will, autonomous, bounded, and self-determining individual. That doesn't mean there are not selves, but it means there is not an individual in the, I might say, Cartesian sense. There's not an individual as discrete and bounded, self-determining, some little nugget down there that is an alienable free space, but always in relationship with an interaction with an environment that affects us even as we affect it. So even when we're alone, we are interacting with remembered and current environmental factors and relational partners. Charles Taylor, philosopher, he puts it this way. He says, our identity is shaped in conversation with the other people who are most important to us. And, quote, even when we outgrow some of the latter, our parents, for instance, and they disappear from our lives, the conversation with them continues inside us as long as we live. Okay, now, this picture is very close to biblical understandings of human being. What is the person, says the psalmist, that thou art mindful of him or her? This very form of the question tells us that the answer comes through the recognition that the person is one whom God minds. God remembers and tends the person, and hence the person has worth and value. From this very beginning, the person is one in relationship. From this perspective, the question, what is a human being, cannot be answered from within isolated individual existence or even the system of body and brain, but only through a loop that extends into the environment, and that environment, crucially, is the domain of a creating, transcendent, and yet immanent God who is intimately involved with human flourishing. That's the picture. This interpersonal picture of the person is broadly shared throughout the biblical texts, whether individual authors, known and unknown, will speak in the first person. There is an I that can speak in the first person. It doesn't have to be a concept of the person. There's an I that speaks in the first person. Addressing God, answering God, in relationship with God and God's people. And the environment, actually the land, is another part of this. This idea of the person as a self in relation goes hand in glove, of course, with the idea of human beings created in the image of God. This means that human beings are created and exist, or are constituted, we might say, in this primal bond with the Creator, in a structure of likeness and difference conveyed by the idea of the image. In the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, the image of God is itself also interpersonal, such that, as theologian Noreen Hertzfeld, who works on actually artificial intelligence and intelligent machines, the image is in the relationship itself, not in our capacity for relationship. This is important. The image is not capacity-based. It's in the relationship itself. It cannot, therefore, the imago Dei cannot be exemplified by one individual. It takes two to tango. This is not a capacities-based idea of the image of God, whether it's my individual capacity for rationality, empathy, relationality, motility, whatever it might be, all the different capacities-based. It's not capacities-based because the image is conveyed and sustained within the relationship itself. It's not just in here, it's in here. That basic idea is profound. The doctrine of the Trinity deepens this notion, but even apart from the doctrine of the Trinity, two further points, or without necessarily relying on it, I shouldn't say apart, two further points derive from a belief that human beings are created in the image of God. First is the obvious point: human beings are creatures. God is the creator. As creatures, human beings discover the cosmos as a personal place, not an impersonal set of rules or laws. This is a different construct for the cosmos. It's a profoundly different construct. It means that it's teleological. It means that it's oriented towards a purpose. And within such a universe, there is freedom, but not the idea of freedom as doing your own thing. Rather, freedom is the liberation of our capacities to do and be far more than we could on our own in this relational matrix. And when I say that, I mean to distinguish the notion of a personal cosmos from a mechanistic cosmos determined by mechanistic laws. For example, in a personal cosmos, rather than talking about free will and determinism, we might rather talk about grace and providence. And determinism and providence get lumped together in some kinds of conversations, but they are not the same. They're not the same. Determinism has the idea, the futurist idea, that the future comes from the present, and the present is determining the future. There's this sense in which things have been determined by what has happened before and by the constraints of the physical world, say. But a providential view says that God orders all things well. That's quite a different model that has functioned in Christian theology for centuries. And it's important not to conflate these. So this means that any talk of human autonomy, scare quotes, or free will, needs to be carefully framed within such a personal picture of the cosmos and an interpersonal picture of human existence within it. The second point is this: creation in the image of God puts human identity on a spectrum between likeness and difference. This is implicit in the concept of mimesis. We are in the image of God, mimetically constructed, we might say in the image of God, but mimesis moves on a spectrum between equivalence. It's not equivalence, and it's not difference. It's something in between. This language of likeness, or mimesis, is used in the New Testament. To be in the image of the other is not to be the same as her, but like and different. And the heart of Christian theology is the conviction that in Christ, God becomes like human beings to an embodied degree, to death, assimilates to human reality, assimilates to the human condition, but yet also retains the divine identity, also retains this difference, this mimetic assimilation into the realm of the other, and yet not absorption. This idea of being like God but not the same as God also comes into play in thinking about ways in which people are shaped by being in relationship with one another, bodily enmeshed in our environments. We become like people in the things with which we interact, but we are never the same. Again, some experimental psychologists will talk about this in terms of an assimilative interaction in which we assimilate to the stance of the other, but we continue always to recognize them as distinct from ourselves. There's an honoring of difference and yet an assimilation. And that in turn leads to interesting questions about AI and robotics, particularly when intelligent machines are designed based on some implicit or explicit models of the person. I'll come back to that. First, a little bit more about the theological aspects of being a system of bodies intersubjectivity environment. In experiential terms, and I'm going to do this by looking at a couple of texts, actually, from the letters of Paul, texts that have always puzzled Pauline interpreters. Earlier, I noted the intense vulnerability entailed in being a system of self in relation, in bodily connection. Well, Paul has a lot to say about that. For Paul, body language is all over the place, soma, by which he does not mean specifically flesh, has a different word for that. Won't go into all of that. But I think for Paul, the human beings are set in a structure of solidarity with the cosmos, for good and for ill. So he articulates this solidarity memorably in a grammar in which the speaker acts, but says simultaneously, it's not me doing the action, but somebody else in me. It's the grammar of I, yet not I, but another in me. And he does this in two places particularly. One is in Romans 7, where he describes the experience of wanting to accomplish the good, but finding to his horror that evil results from his actions. Here's what he says: I don't understand what I'm doing. I don't do what I want, but I do what I hate. Now, if I do what I do not want, I agree the law is good. So then it's no longer I who does it, but sin dwelling in me. And he repeats it. It's no longer I, if I do what I don't want, it's no longer I who does it, but sin dwelling in me. So Paul scholars wrestle with this a lot. His Christian theology has wrestled with this. I never agreed. Paul scholars never agree on anything, actually. But something intervenes between the self's desire for the good, I want the good, he says, and the outcome of the self's actions. And he names that something sin. He calls it sin, which he personifies here as a hostile alien agent, an indwelling agency that is also an environment under which human beings suffer, an indwelling agency that intervenes between the desire for a good outcome and the actual outcome itself. What he depicts here is a self constituted in relationship, but that relationship is an impersonal systemic entity that he calls sin. I don't know if we would call that an I-it relationship or what, but it is an interpersonal, intersubjective almost constitution of an I, an acting subject, in which the agency, the effective agency of that I is evacuated, is taken away, is lessened. Still recognizes this disjunction, but cannot change it. Now here's a similar grammatical construction of the self as a self in relation, but with a radically different relational partner, we might say. So in Galatians 2, famously, Paul says, I have been crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the flesh, I live in the realm of trust generated by the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Now, the difference between these two constructions of the self is structurally parallel and substantially opposite. The difference depends on the other yet indwelling actors, sin that dwells in me or Christ that dwells in me. So in both, Paul depicts very vividly the experience of being a self in relation, not a self in self relation primarily, but an other relation, embodied, socially embedded with the benefits and dangers of being in such connection. When he says, I, yet not I, but sin dwelling in me, accomplishes deeds contrary to my own best intentions, he formulates a way of talking about systemic evil that actually is extremely fruitful for talking about sin in a way that exceeds individual wrongdoing. It has a lot of traction, actually, for talking about global wrongs, about social wrongs, and so forth, and about the way in which we are constrained and bound. But also when he says, I no longer live, but Christ lives in me, and yet I still live, he portrays God as both transcendent and intimately involved in a new kind of human agency. So something like this is in Paul's account of the person. Now, if we see human beings, as Gallagher says, and many others, as constituted in an intersubjective loop, we actually have a way of talking about personhood that I think is amenable to Paul. It gives us a way of talking that bridges some of the divides. Now, and the thing is that what is unique, of course, is the way in which the relational environment, so to speak, is articulated. And here we are fundamentally constituted in relationship with a God who is gracious and who operates towards us on the basis of gift rather than any capacity or worth that we might have. So, I know my time is brief. I'll tell briefly a story and then some payouts from this. When John was talking about the ontological foundation as relational of personhood, I was reminded of a time I was visiting, in my role as a parish priest, I was visiting a nursing home and conducting a worship service. You never know what's going on because most of the people in the room have some form of dementia, and there you are, feeling like an idiot, really, talking. You don't know. You have no idea what's going on. But there was a woman sitting in the front row in her wheelchair, and she was staring into space, and she said over and over and over again, this mantra, this continuo, I love you, and you love me. I love you, and you love me. She never stopped. That was the ground of her being, underneath everything else that continued. I think that's a lovely picture of that. All right, so just briefly, some theological implications and then some questions for our topics here. One is, I think this helps us with criterialism about persons. In other words, a lot of the discussion is what is the criteria by which we would understand a person. It is usually what constitutes a person, what gives a human being the status of a person, if we would say that there are non-person human beings, as some would say. And they're always capacity-based. They're always based in the assumption that a human being is essentially an individual creature and are there capacities within that creature, even a capacity for relationality within that creature that then qualify them for the status of personhood. But in this picture, if the self is self-constituted in relationship always, if the location of the self is not just in here, but here, then the criterialism shifts. We can't think in those terms of some innate capacity coming from within the self. We have to think rather of personhood moving in the realm of gift. And of course, that isn't extremely vulnerable. The only thing that makes it because we have seen how personhood can be withheld to whole populations. Personhood is withheld by other human beings. But if personhood is in the realm of a divine gift, if the gift is given by God without criteria, without regard to worth, which is the definition of grace, one way of understanding grace is a gift given without regard to worth, then that creates a different foundation for understanding what a person is, what constitutes persons, and it does not exclude. This is driven home by the incarnation, in which God takes form, takes human flesh in the most liminal, dehumanized possible way in the Roman Empire, in Paul's words, in the form of a slave, unto death, not just death, but death by crucifixion. So this is extremely inclusive in the ancient world way to think about what constitutes a person. Secondly, the dualism questions. Dualism is complicated by thinking about where it's located. And if dualism is located primarily in an individualistic notion of the self, and we would talk about a dualism between an immaterial soul and a physical body, something like that, we worry about that. But if in fact the person, again, is existing here in relationship with God, who is both immanent and transcendent, immanent through the incarnation, immanent through creation, immanent through the Spirit working in the body of Christ, the community of faith. This God is immanent, but also transcendent. Then instead of worrying about an immaterial soul and a partitioned notion of the self, a partition notion, no, what we have instead is a picture of the whole self in relationship with a God who pulls us into the future, who extends who we are beyond the limits of our physical existence, but yet operates within it. Brief comments. Okay, so my time is about up. Let me ask a few questions about the implications of this, potentially, and I'm sure there's much more we could say, for thinking about our interaction with, creation of and interaction with machines. If we are increasingly shaped by interaction with human-like, scare quotes, intelligent machines, what does that do to our identity? I think that's one of the basic questions of this conference. What is the effect on us? And we come back full circle to the concerns of Rodney Brooks that I gave at the beginning of the lecture, but also some of the work of Sherry Turkle. I think this is immediate and present. The question of what is happening, what happens to us if we are in this relational loop, body environment, intersubjectivity loop, but the other is more of a machine rather than a person. So that's one question. And the other is how might different understandings or category understandings, I think we've heard this a lot, of what machines are and are not, influence the effects of machine-human interface. If machines are primarily doppelgangers, if we're trying to make them to replicate human cognition, to do what we do but better, quote unquote, and I don't know what better means in this case, then we're actually exporting an idea of what we are that might not be true, i.e., autonomy becomes really important in thinking about human-like machines, but are we autonomous? You see how it works. Or are machines in the category of tools? Are machines in the category not of persons, but of tools? This is a basic question which has already been brought up here. And how would that change the way we think about the effects of machines on who we are, who we think we are? All right, I think that's enough for now. I think my time is up a little bit more, and so I'll stop for now. Thanks. I've got something.
Thanks so much, Susan. That's fascinating stuff, and To be honest, I was dewy-eyed at this wonderful description of the person saying, "I love you and you love me."
That's amazing.
It is a deep. It's interesting how sometimes very simple words can be very profound. And perhaps if I could just, an anecdote comes into my head of a very elderly, demented man who was a Christian believer and who had been a man of great prayer, but who had become virtually mute, and his daughter was caring for him. And on an impulse, she said to him, "Do you still pray, Dad?" And he'd become virtually mute. And he said, "Yes." And she said, "What do you say to God when you pray?" And there's this long pause, and he says, "I say, hello." And that was it.
That's really lovely. That's really lovely.
But anyway, thanks so much, Susan. And please, anybody like to respond? Questions?
Sure.
Thank you. It's put into my mind the piece of scripture that when two persons are gathered in my name, the prayer has more power. Could this be a definition of personhood, that one of the persons could be a machine, and if it's indistinguishable from a human being, would God kind of be? I haven't thought this through very much. I've only just thought about it. Would God would be more accommodating? So I'm sorry it's not a very clear question, but I've only just thought about it.
Actually, when two or three are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst of them.
Yeah. Can this be a definition of personhood, is what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, let me just unpack that a bit. That God would be more accommodating is not the way I would see it at all, because again, I see this as all moving in the realm of gift. It is a promise that God will be present when two or three are gathered in my name. And then that's the basic thing. Whether the machine would be a person in that, well, the question, I guess, would be whether a machine would be gathered in God's name, number one. And number two, whether, I don't know what prayer would mean for a machine, frankly, no matter how advanced they were. It's kind of nonsensical to me. I don't know what that would mean except a simulation of prayer. And a simulation of prayer, well, we had this debate last night, would not be the same as prayer. But the question further would be, I've talked about the personhood being constituted not in a bounded entity, but in the relational matrix. And if personhood is constituted in that relational matrix, well, that depends on God's gifting and God's interaction with us. We have to get away from thinking it all depends on us. Yeah. So I don't know what that would mean for a machine.
Yeah, well, it puzzles me, would that be a definition of personhood? But I think you've just answered that. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Over there.
Thank you very much. So you emphasized the importance of the environment and relationality for understanding personhood. And I was thinking that it seems pretty close to David Chalmers and Annie Clark's extended mind thesis, that the mind extends through the body into its environment.
Yeah.
I was wondering what you were thinking about that.
Yeah, I've played with that a little bit and thinking about cognition. Actually, that's a really interesting point. That's kind of one of my smaller next projects. Yeah, that extended cognition in the body of Christ and the way in which we might think of. I do think the way Paul talks about the Spirit is always in this interpersonal way. When Paul talks about the Spirit, he will use a singular pronouns, but it would be better translated, say Romans 8, as the Spirit in your midst, the Spirit among you, the Spirit moving between you. And so the idea of the Spirit as working in the community of faith to generate a different kind of extended cognition, I think is a really interesting idea. I want to explore that some more. So yeah, thank you.
Could I just make a comment on that? I can see similarities, but I would think that both Chalmers and Andy Clark are actually still operating within the Enlightenment boundaried person, the autonomous, boundaried person who extends out into the environment, whereas that's fundamentally different, isn't it, from this biblical understanding, where that is idolatrous. There is no such thing as the autonomous boundaried self. Instead, there is the relationality, this, which I thought was beautiful, and the mimesis. That's very profound, isn't it? The identity, the movement. How did you put it, between identity and equivalence, that there is...
Right, it's on a spectrum.
Yes, a spectrum.
Mimesis. But also what you're talking about is the reciprocal two-way exchange that is initiated and sustained by God. And so it's rather than by us. Not that we do not participate in it, but yet theologically this depends on the line of movement, is what one of my mentors used to call it. The line of movement that fundamentally extends from God to us, but yet initiates our movement as well. So I think that's helpful. Thank you.
I would suggest, therefore, there is a danger in, from a Christian perspective, from a perspective of faith, reading secular writers and researchers and saying, "Oh, that matches with, oh, that I could use that. That's sympathetic to a Christian worldview." Whereas actually, it is still coming from this profoundly hostile, in one sense, enlightenment, or whatever you want to call it, perspective of individualism and individuality.
Well, that's where we have to really parse it out carefully, isn't it?
It is.
Because, for example, Gallagher's not thinking in theological terms.
No,
He's not operating in that. Vittorio Galassi, this neuroscientist who talks this way, is not operating in that. And I've talked with him and pushed him on autonomy, and he falls back on autonomy, even though everything he says undercuts that claim, but he can't give it up, But nonetheless, there's a basis for a conversation. There's at least there are at least conversation points, which is better than nothing.
No, I absolutely agree.
There's one over there.
So you've argued very convincingly that the system is bigger than we might initially think. But is this intended, really two questions arising from this. The first is this intended as an argument that we can't simulate this bigger system? I mean, it's a very powerful argument that the singularity is not round the corner, but already I can feel colleagues proposing the simulation of interactions, of relationships, of embodiment. Of course, it's a very difficult problem, but is it intended to argue that we can't? And secondly, you add another argument, in effect, as to why these simulations are not really people, not really persons, because they're not really in relationship. But will it help us to tell that? Will we be any further ahead in being able to show that they're not really people because of that?
Right. This is the communication issue, again, I think, that you were talking about. Yeah. So I think, again, you could simulate, it's just language, again, you could simulate the system. I mean, it sounds to me, I've been learning here, because it's not my field, I've been learning about simulations of, well, there are robots that learn from the environment, that are interactive, increasingly interactive, and all of this would seem to be a simulation of this system of self and relation. So I think that, sure, that's possible. I've also been reminded by computer friends that this is basically algorithms. I would want to say that the simulation is only as big as the imagination and technical capabilities of those who are producing it, right? And so, so even the simulation of a relational environment is only going to extend that far. It can only extend that far. It might appear to be quite convincing, but it assumes it can only operate within a certain bounds of imagination. I think, and so the distinction between a simulation and a reality will still remain. You might simulate prayer, but again, from a theological perspective, we would have to say, without the activity of God, that's ultimately it ends in death. All of this ends in death. I guess the transhumanists want to get beyond death. I guess. I think something essential to humanity is lost in that, personally. But of course, that's another bigger conversation. So would I persuade somebody for whom that's enough? The question would be, is that enough? Does that make some sense? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Some people won't be persuaded. I recognize that. There was another.
Thanks very much. Any other questions back then? Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Everybody's pointing to everybody else.
We're being very relational here. Stephen first. Stephen first.
I don't know what this illustrates.
Yes. It's two Christians trying to decide who goes through a door first.
I'll be very quick here. It occurs to me that it's maybe worth thinking a bit about the way we as humans simulate prayer as well. You know, the Lord's Prayer, it's sometimes said, is a case not of Jesus teaching us a prayer, but teaching us to pray. Mm-hmm. And we can bring out the words in prayer and think we have prayed, and actually, have we prayed? We actually have done something which an atheist could do by simply putting on a pious tone of voice and reading something out. So it might be good for us to reflect, actually, I think, on our own capacities to simulate.
Absolutely.
I don't know if you agree, Susan, with that.
And that actually, I think, because I don't know any honest Christian who hasn't worried that they're faking it at some point. You know, I mean, so again, it does seem to me that there is a balance to that. That's a reality. I mean, we do that. I think that happens. And then we can endlessly question ourselves about that as well. And so, again, there is the sense in which the divine action is what makes the prayer actually real, in a sense. I mean, the reality of prayer depends on God being active and present. You know, the reality of prayer does not simply depend on my sincerity, whatever that would be. I mean, those are very slippery things. And so, again, I would want to say that God's involvement, intimate involvement in humanity is what makes it possible for things not to be simulated. Sorry.
I suppose it's worth asking whether a computer could ever ask itself, am I simulating prayer or am I really praying?
Thank you. We'll leave that one.
It just occurred to me that also, of course, in Jesus' confrontation with the Pharisees, this was a major issue. It's about hypocrisy. It's about play acting. And Christ says righteousness is from the heart. So it's interesting, isn't it? To that extent, the simulation is a very ancient issue, and has been as part of the tradition.
Yeah.
Was there another? No, Hilary here.
I'd just like to pick up a little bit on something I think William was alluding to. You know, I really like what you're proposing, that personhood is not to do with capacity, that it's in relationship, and that ultimately, in the Christian theological frame, personhood is something that is conveyed by God as the prime example of one in relation. And of course, that has enormous implications for people who cannot relate well to other human beings, someone with advanced dementia or brain incapacity or whatever, because it actually takes away any sense that they have to have a certain capacity in order to do so. But if you translate that to human relationship with machines, then I think you get potentially into some difficulties. Does that mean that if an individual ascribes personhood to a machine, then it therefore has it because that has come out of... And then conversely, perhaps even in a world where machines might ascribe something to human beings. Can you see the dilemma?
Right, I've thought about that, yeah. I wonder, and I guess in a way I thought, well, in talking about the vulnerability and dangers attendant on this intersubjective construction of identity or personhood, of course the vulnerabilities and dangers are insofar as as people do this to one another, well, this can be a tremendously gracious gift, or it can be extremely dangerous because, I mean, with regard to other people, we withhold personhood. I mentioned that. But also, I mean, if my personhood is dependent upon a gift, then a great deal depends on the giver, and so the giver can withhold or give this gift of the worth of and dignity of personhood. So that's why I tie it to God, and that would mean that God decides, not I, the personhood. I might ascribe in my imagining personhood to a machine. I mean, I feel this way about my laptop sometimes when I get really angry at it. So, you know, and I blame it. This is ascribing personhood to a machine in a very simple, basic way. But really, I do not, personhood is really only a gift that God can give. Now, that's a theological point, but it does instill certain humility. It does call for a certain humility that is a Christian virtue and not necessarily a secular virtue. I recognize that issue. I mean, you know, so in practice I might think that. I would then be buying into a notion of my capacities that was ultimately idolatrous, I suppose. You know, yeah.
Thanks very much. That's very interesting and helpful. A reflection of my own, and that is that in clinical experience, one of the fascinating things about medicine is that you meet people often under tragic circumstances, but conceptually what is happening, or what seems to be happening, is that a concept such as human personhood is being tested to destruction. It's like,
Yes.
if you take away this, and you take away that, and you remove this, and you make that difficult, are they still a person? It's being, as you say, it's a liminal case. It's being pushed to the liminal cases. And I think I and other Christian physicians who see it similarly would say we still believe that even in this most liminal cases, there is something that is retained. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that, and that something includes relationality. It does include the desire to reach out. And one of those liminal cases is the locked-in syndrome, where you have somebody who is in a body that is completely unresponsive. So in one sense, this represents a version of the brain in the vat, except that it's something that has happened to a being who has been through the entire developmental sequence, including relationships previously, but then a catastrophe strikes, and they are now a brain in a vat, almost. And the fascinating thing is that almost, as far as I'm aware, exclusively, people who are in this situation are trying to reach out. And there's a wonderful example. There was an editor of Elle magazine in France called Frédéric Bauby, who this happened to him in his 40s. He was a well-known person, and he woke up in hospital completely unable to communicate. And eventually he learned to communicate by blinking and with a speech therapist. And he eventually dictated an entire book, letter by letter.
By blinking.
By blinking.
That's amazing.
And the story actually, and he wrote the book, and the book is called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. And the diving bell is his body, and the butterfly is his mind, which is free to think. And there's a wonderful film, which actually is well worth seeing, which is taken through the first-person perspective. So you actually see through, and, you know, your eyelid is opened, and you see out. And the whole thing is done from the first-person perspective. But the fascinating thing is that what then happens is Bowlby's entire relation things. It turns out he's married, he's got children, and he's also having an affair.
He realizes
and his wife comes, you know, and then his mistress comes to the bedside, and there's all these complicated relationships. So despite the fact that he's still in this state, all these relationships, all this complexity is being enacted. So it's a way, an illustration of that, and of the strangeness and the mystery of these tragic but profound cases.
Thank you very much indeed. Susan's very interesting talk and a lot of, I think, very helpful ideas. What I wanted to try to think about was what implications this might have for some of the debates that we've touched on, perhaps some of the more traditional debates in philosophy. I mean, you've mentioned some of that very briefly at the end, but one of the things that I wonder is whether some of these debates still arise, albeit in a slightly different context. So just to take the issue of the capacities that you mentioned, that it's about the reality of the relationship rather than just the capacity for it, for example. But I wonder then, is there also, whilst wanting to emphasize, as you've done, this interpersonal nature of things, whether there's also, if you like, an individual component, I'm not sure if that's the right way to put it, but that for those interpersonal relationships to be there, the different parties have to have particular capacities. So for example, God has created us to be in relationship with himself, and that might in some way be constitutive of who we are. Nevertheless, he created us as a particular kind of entity in order to have that relationship. He couldn't have had that relationship with stones or trees, for example. It requires a particular kind of entity with certain capacities.
Yeah, I don't think it's an either or. I don't think that there's no self or individual. There are some folks, for example, who interpret Paul as saying that now. It's a pendulum swing, it's a trendy swing, frankly. There's only the community. I don't think that. I think that there is still a self, very much. So I would not want to say there's no self. But what I'm talking about is something a little bit deeper, in a sense, that self in interpersonal relation is already from the ground up constituted in this relational way. So that the capacities to relate themselves grow out of a prior given relational construct, which is often not always, and there are some cases where this doesn't seem to be the case, but usually, the body, it's as if the body is made for this. So in the womb, birth, there are bodily events that are connecting people that then are part of the scaffolding of the capacities themselves. So there's a circle here between the relational intersubjectivity within the person that is then that then generates further connection. And even in cases where that seems to be lacking, in the primary case is autism. Autism in some of these philosophical discussions becomes the other that shows, it's really problematic, that shows by the absence of relationality the way in which relationality is the norm. But actually, even the autobiographies of communicative autistic people will show that there's the desire for connection and that their capacities, their agency is facilitated by extremely delicate, intense, committed involvement by others in their own expression of themselves, so that they are facilitated. It makes visible this facilitation of the capacity to have an agency. So I think it's not an either or, but still we can talk about where those capacities come from. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
Thanks very much. That's very helpful.
Just to sort of a little expand your argument and to think about this notion of personhood as a gift, actually brings the question of debt and also forgiveness to a certain extent, because in both these cases, the primordial body, the locus of intersubjective self-relation, actually gives itself to a certain kind of a debt, gives itself to a certain relationship of absence and not of presence. And if this happens in our religious and spiritual experience, then this could be also extended to the robot, because that comes as another, as part of that web of relationship. And the kind of intentionality through which we see this web of relationship, the robot suddenly might share or start sharing the same kind of intentionality, although its primordial body is very different than my primordial body as a human being. So within difference, a certain shared web of relationality is also possible, but without certain aspects of gift and forgiveness and certain other primordial qualities of the primordial body. But should that be considered as an important lack on the part of the robot, not to have a shared sense of being a person? I don't know whether.
Hi, I was working really hard to follow you there. So I got, first you talked about debt. Debt, D-E-B-T, debt. Well, that in itself is a big topic with regard to the notion of gift. So that's one topic. And then you talked about lack, and then you talked about a robot lacking. Right, and does that then limit its personhood? Well, I think I've said yes to that. Let me just be brief on that one. Yeah, I mean, I could talk on about grace, gift, and debt, and different ways of thinking about that, but I don't know if that's what I should do right now. I'd be happy to do that later. Yeah.
Okay, perhaps the conversation could carry on and one-to-one. Over there?
This gentleman spoke about gifting personhood. We've been gifted with personhood, and we're assuming, I think, that machines would want to be gifted with personhood.
I don't know what it means for a machine to want.
Well,
frankly, I really
exactly.
don't.
Well, this is what I'm thinking. Is a machine bothered whether we value it sufficiently to give it personhood or not? Or would a super-intelligent machine perhaps be insulted to be given personhood, given that it's more evolved than us, and as people, we perhaps are insulted when we're considered animals?
Well, I don't, ascribing insult and intentionality to machines, I don't know what that would mean. But I would say if we gift machines with anything, it's with machinehood. Yeah, I gift machines with machinehood. So, you know, God gives us with personhood. God may gift dolphins with dolphinhood. For all and that's fine with me, you know. Let's just not mix up the categories here. That's my quick answer to that one. Yeah, okay.
Richard. Let's go. Where are you?
I think we're kind of moving towards coffee, aren't we? But one of the problems lots of contemporary philosophers and people in my world in computer science have with contemporary extended mind theorists is our conviction and our training that basically their research turns on a category mistake. And the category mistake muddles the brain with the mind. And one of the things you've been describing for me is actually you're interested in a particular sort of category, and that category is the mind. So you might feel like saying, whereas Gallagher tries to describe how football players' muscles work, you're interested in how a football game works. The football game is a different phenomenon to the arrangement of muscles in a football player. Gallagher tries to stretch his argument to say from muscles, the taxonomies of muscles, arrangements of muscles through skin to wear to a system, you can move towards the game. And you can't. And that's what, you know, that's the kind of canonical argument in classical philosophy. You're trying to seek credit in Gallagher's argument when you're actually interested in the game. The game is relationality, it's in ideas, it's in the premises of understanding, it's in the thing that's not to be found in materiality. So I wonder why you want to have that, you're making a fight for yourself, and I wonder why you need to have that fight.
Well, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. I'll have to ponder that, you know, because I don't think Gallagher sees his work in the way you're describing it, as nearly as I can tell. I mean, I've basically been thinking that, I mean, where I come from on this project is that we've lacked categories for interpreting Paul's language for a long time because we've been sort of in the shadow of the Enlightenment, I might say. And so the pushback against that might open up new categories to help interpret Paul today. But you're saying that that particular category doesn't work, and I'll have to think about that some more. You know, that is not something the way I had thought about it. Yeah, so I mean, I appreciate the comment for my own thinking.
It sounds like an important discussion, doesn't it? But maybe it's coffee time and we should have it over coffee. But let's say thanks very much to Susan. And,